The smell hit Instructor Kael'vor before he saw anything. It was not blood, not fear musk, not the sharp mineral scent of a predator that had gone too long without food. He had worked the beast training compound on Vethra Station for 19 years, and he knew every smell the facility produced. This was something else. Organic. Faintly sweet in a way that shouldn't have existed inside a room containing 4 Apex-class predators. He stepped through the intake corridor and stopped. The human female was sitting cross-legged on the floor. Not against the wall. Not near the observation barrier. On the floor, in the open center of the room, in the space that every certified handler knew you never occupied, the space the predators considered undisputed territory. And in her lap, pressed against her body with their eyes still closed, were 2 Vethran shadow cubs. Not sedated. Not restrained. Sleeping. Kael'vor did not move for a long moment. 3 questions arrived simultaneously, and none of them had answers he could reach. How had she obtained the cubs? How were they still alive? And why, in the far corner of the room, was the largest adult Vethran shadow cat he had ever seen lying with its chin on the ground, watching the human with an expression he had no professional category for? He had worked with predators for 19 years. He had never seen one bow. Her name was Specialist Dara Osei, and she had been assigned to Vethra Station 11 weeks ago as part of the Galactic Compact's Human Integration Initiative, which was a program that most station commanders treated with the same enthusiasm they reserved for plumbing failures and budget audits. She was the first human the compound had processed. The intake form listed her prior experience as wildlife rehabilitation 8 years, which Kael'vor had read as meaningless, because human wildlife was not Vethran wildlife, and the comparison was roughly equivalent to saying you had experience with water because you had once stood in rain. He had assigned her to perimeter observation. Watching. Not touching. Certainly not entering active handling zones. He had not checked on her for 6 days, because the perimeter observation assignment required no supervision and she had submitted her reports on time, and the reports had been, if he was being precise about it, the most detailed behavioral documentation he had received from any handler trainee in 4 years. He had read them and found them impressive and then set them aside, because impressive documentation from a trainee who was not yet cleared for floor access was not a problem he needed to solve. He was beginning to understand that he had made an error. Specialist Osei, he said. She looked up. She did not look startled. She looked like someone who had known he was there for some time and had been waiting for him to speak first. Instructor. What? He said very carefully. Are you doing? She looked down at the cubs in her lap, then back at him. They were cold, she said. The heat regulation in the nursery section was miscalibrated by 0.4 degrees. I flagged it in my report on day 9. He had read that report. He had forwarded it to maintenance. That does not explain why you are sitting in the open zone. The mother was agitated, she said. When the cubs are cold, she paces the perimeter. When she paces the perimeter, it triggers the secondary males. I needed her to stop pacing. So you picked up her cubs. After she let me. Dara said this simply, the way someone states a fact they do not consider remarkable. It took about 40 minutes. Kael'vor looked at the adult female in the corner. She was watching Dara with the specific quality of attention that shadowcats reserved for things they had decided were within their sphere of protection. He had seen that expression directed at cubs. At nesting sites. Once, years ago, at an injured member of their own pack that the female had decided to guard until it recovered. He had never seen it directed at a handler. You have been here 11 weeks, he said. Yes. You are not certified for floor contact. No, she agreed. And in 11 weeks, you have apparently convinced a full-grown Vethran shadow cat, a predator species that requires 3 years of graduated conditioning and a team of 4 certified handlers before it permits any physical contact with non-pack members, to allow you to hold her cubs. Dara considered this. 2 cubs, she said. The third is with the secondary female. I'm working on that one. There was a third cub. He hadn't noticed. He looked to the left and saw, behind the secondary feeding station, another shadow cat. Also lying down. Also watching. Also doing the thing he had no professional category for. Specialist Osei, Calvor said. And then he stopped, because he was a professional with 19 years of experience and he understood that the question he wanted to ask was not a professional question. The question he wanted to ask was, "What are you?" What he said instead was, "My office. When you're done." He left the floor before she could answer, because he needed a moment alone with the fact that his perimeter observer had done something in 11 weeks that his senior certified handlers had not achieved in years, and he needed to decide what to do about it before he said something that revealed exactly how unsettled he was. He did not succeed. By the time Dara arrived in his office 40 minutes later, Calvor had reviewed her 9 filed reports in full, and he had found something he had missed the first time, something that changed the character of every observation she had made. In each report, embedded in the behavioral data with the same clinical precision she applied to everything, were notes she had labeled comparative. Small observations about veteran shadowcat behavior that she had cross-referenced against something she called terrestrial felid socialization literature. She had been, he realized, not just watching the predators. She had been reading them against a framework she brought from Earth. And that framework had told her things about the shadowcats that 19 years of veteran-specific training had apparently not told him. She sat down across from him without being invited to, which was either a human cultural difference or confidence, and he no longer felt certain he could distinguish between those two things. "You cross-referenced veteran apex predator behavior with Earth cat literature," he said. "Felid behavior," she said. "Yes. The convergent evolution is significant. Same ambush predator body plan, same hierarchical pack structure with a dominant female, same core bonding mechanism based on scent and warmth and passive presence. I thought the framework might hold. And if it hadn't?" She paused. It was a short pause, but it was honest. "Then I would have had a problem," she said. "You would have been killed." "Possibly," she said. But the behavioral read was solid. The mother wasn't aggressive, she was anxious. Anxious animals and aggressive animals look similar from a distance, but they respond to completely different interventions. You approach an anxious predator with stillness and warmth. You do not withdraw. Withdrawal confirms threat. I stayed still and let her decide. Calvor looked at her for a long moment. She was not large. She was not physically imposing in any way that his instincts registered as significant. She was a small, warm-blooded biped from a planet that the Compact's integration files described as biologically diverse, strategically moderate, no immediate significance. She had sat in the open zone of a predator enclosure, without armor, without certified backup, without any formal clearance, and let a shadow cat decide whether or not to trust her. And the shadow cat had decided yes. "Why didn't you report what you were doing?" he said. "I did," she said. Day 9. The heat regulation note. Day 12. I noted that the female's anxiety response was consistent with maternal stress and that the environmental factor was the primary driver. Day 15. I noted that I had begun passive presence sessions in the outer ring of the open zone, within the female's visual field. She met his eyes without blinking. I reported everything. The reports were accurate. He thought about the reports. They had been accurate. They had been precise. They had contained everything she described. He had read them and processed them as behavioral data and filed them as satisfactory trainee documentation, and he had not understood what he was reading because he had not expected the trainee to be doing anything worth understanding. "I misread your reports," he said. He said it because it was true, and because he had spent 19 years in this compound believing that the most important quality a handler could have was honesty about what they didn't know. "Most people do," she said. And then, before he could respond to that, "What happens now?" What happened next was the thing that Calvor would spend the following months trying to explain to people who had not been there, and what he discovered was that the facts of it were perfectly communicable and the meaning of it was not. He could tell people what he had done, which was to grant specialist Dara Osei immediate provisional floor access and submit an emergency certification review request to the compound authority. He could tell people what the authority had said, which was that provisional floor access for an uncertified trainee was a Level 4 protocol violation and that he was personally liable for any resulting incident. He could tell them that he had acknowledged the violation and maintained the access anyway, which had resulted in a formal inquiry that was still open 3 months later. What he could not tell them was what it had felt like to watch her work. The formal assessment came 14 weeks after that first morning in the office. 14 weeks during which Dara had moved through the compound's full roster of Apex-class predators with the same patient, attentive, unhurried methodology she had applied to the Shadowcats. Not rushing. Not performing. Working through each species with the same cross-referencing approach, identifying the convergent behavioral architecture, finding the thread of logic that connected Earth's predator ecology to Vethra's, and following it. Not every attempt worked immediately. The Grell pack assessment was the one Kael'vor had watched most carefully, because the Grell were not Felid adjacent. They were pack hunters operating on entirely different social architecture, and he had expected, if he was being honest with himself, to finally see the framework fail. The Grell had a bonding mechanism based on synchronized physical rhythm. Pack members established trust through movement coordination, through the matching of gait and breath and the subtle physical signaling of aligned intention. It was a mechanism that took certified handlers 3 to 4 months to approximate convincingly, using training protocols developed over a decade of behavioral research. On day 3 with the Grell, Kael'vor found Dara standing at the edge of their zone, doing something that took him a moment to identify. She was breathing in time with the pack's dominant male. Not exaggerated. Not performed. A quiet, visible synchronization that she had apparently been practicing alone before she entered the zone, because when she stepped in, the dominant male's ear position shifted in the way that Kael'vor had only ever seen it shift for another Grell. "How did you know?" he said afterward. "Drum circles," she said. He waited. It's a human practice. Communal rhythm as a bonding mechanism. The Grell used the same underlying social logic. You establish trust by demonstrating that you can move in the same space at the same time without creating conflict. "I've been doing it since I was 9. She shrugged. The hard part was matching the Grell's resting respiratory rate. Their lungs are slower than mine. You modified your breathing. For about 4 days before I went in, she said. I practiced at night. Kael'vor thought about a human sitting alone in her quarters in the dark, practicing the breath pattern of an alien predator. He thought about the 4 days of preparation embedded invisibly in what appeared, from outside, to be a natural gift. He thought about how many times he had watched something she did and called it instinct, and how many times instinct had actually been 4 days of invisible work that she simply hadn't mentioned. He filed this information alongside everything else he was accumulating and did not yet know what to do with. The formal assessment day arrived on a morning that Kael'vor remembered as being unusually cold for Vethra Station, a fact that should have been trivial and that he found himself unable to set aside. The Compound Authority had sent 2 senior evaluators, neither of whom he knew personally, both of whom had reviewed his Level 4 violation report and arrived with the specific quality of polite skepticism that regulatory officials carry when they expect to spend a day documenting incompetence. The lead evaluator was a Serenthi named Ovithkes, and she was introduced as having 32 years in the field, more than anyone else in the room, a fact she did not state but which her posture communicated with complete efficiency. She reviewed the compound's current active roster, noted the number and classification of apex species on floor, and then looked at Kael'vor with a particular expression. You have a provisionally certified human handler working the full apex roster, she said. It was not a question. Yes, he said. The full roster includes 2 Grell packs, 3 Shadowcat families, 1 Vethran cavespine colony, and the Drath. The Drath. He had not mentioned the Drath in any of his reports to the Authority because the Drath was classified separately, not as an apex predator but as a Category 1 behavioral hazard, which was a distinction that existed because apex predator implied a ceiling on the threat level and the Drath did not have one. It was the only creature in the compound that had never been successfully conditioned to any handler interaction. It lived in its zone. It was fed remotely. The behavioral research on it was incomplete because every attempt to gather direct observational data had ended the same way. The Drath has a separate classification, Kael'vor said. Yes, Ovithkes said. It does. She was watching him with the careful attention of someone who already knows the answer to the question they're about to ask. Has the human handler had contact with the draft? Kael'vor opened his mouth, and then he closed it, and then he said, I'll let her speak to her own work. He should have seen it coming. He had seen enough of Dara's work by now that he should have known. But knowing and believing are different mechanisms, and there are things a person cannot fully believe until they have watched them happen with their own eyes in real time, with no preparation and no distance. Dara arrived for the assessment at the standard morning hour, wearing the same plain compound uniform she always wore, carrying nothing. Ovithkes introduced herself. Dara said good morning with the same unhurried quality she applied to everything. The senior evaluator ran her through the preliminary certifications, the documented work, the species roster, the behavioral assessments, and Dara answered each question with precision and without embellishment. Then Ovithkes said, the draft. Dara said, yes. You've made contact? Passive presence contact, Dara said. Not physical. Not yet. Not yet, Ovithkes repeated. She said it the way someone repeats a phrase when the phrase contains something they cannot fully process at normal speed. I've been at the zone boundary for 36 sessions, Dara said. Approximately 14 hours of accumulated passive presence. The draft has been within 3 meters of the boundary line for the last 9 sessions. It hasn't charged the barrier in the last 11. The draft had not gone near the boundary line in 4 years. Kael'vor knew this because he had the sensor logs. What have you been doing during these sessions? Ovithkes said. Reading, Dara said. The silence that followed was the particular quality of silence that exists when a professional with 32 years of experience has heard something that should be absurd and cannot immediately find the argument for why it is. You've been reading, Ovithkes said. The draft responds to sustained non-reactive presence, Dara said. Any behavior that reads as attention-seeking or goal-directed increases its threat response. Reading is genuinely absorbed behavior. I'm not performing disinterest. I'm actually not interested in it during those sessions. I'm reading. The draft reads that accurately. You are telling me, Ovithkes said slowly, that the behavioral solution to a Category 1 hazard that this compound has been unable to address for 4 years was to sit outside its zone and read a book. For 14 hours, Dara said. Over 36 sessions. And I haven't solved it yet. I said passive presence contact. That's not resolution. That's groundwork. Ovithkes looked at Kael'vor. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who has had 25 weeks to adjust to this and has not fully managed it. I want to see the sensor logs from the last 11 sessions, Ovithkes said. They watched the logs together. Kael'vor had watched them before, but watching them with fresh eyes beside someone who had 32 years of field expertise and a visible tension in her jaw produced a different experience. The logs showed the draft. And they showed, near the zone boundary, a human figure sitting still with an object in her hands, and they showed, session by session, the draft moving closer. Not charging. Not circling. Not displaying. Moving closer with the specific quality of movement that predators use when they are trying to resolve an ambiguity. When something is in their space that does not behave like prey and does not behave like threat and does not fit the existing categories and the predator needs to understand what it is. It's trying to classify her, Ovithkes said quietly. Not to anyone in particular. Yes, Dara said, from beside them, and both the evaluator and Kael'vor registered simultaneously that they had not heard her move. And it can't, Ovithkes said. Not yet, Dara said. Give it another 8 sessions. Maybe 10. Ovithkes turned and looked at her. It was not the look she had arrived with. It was not the polite skepticism of a regulatory official expecting to document incompetence. It was something more complicated, a look that contained professional recognition and a kind of careful personal unease, the expression of someone who has encountered a thing they respect and are not entirely sure they should. What is your read on it? She said. On the draft. Not the behavioral data. Your read. Dar was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was different. Not softer. More precise. It's lonely, she said. Ovithkes said nothing. Every behavioral response it has that's been categorized as aggression, Dara said, reads to me as frustrated communication. It has been in a space with no beings that it can successfully interact with for 4 years. It's not dangerous because it's a threat. It's dangerous because it's been trying to say something and nothing in this compound speaks the language. She paused. I'm working on learning the language. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. It was the silence of a room where something has been said that rearranges the space it was said in. It was Calvor who spoke first. That's not in any of your written reports, he said. No, she said. It isn't. I wasn't sure enough. Are you sure enough now? She considered this with genuine care. I'm sure enough to say it to people who are trying to understand what I'm doing, she said. Not sure enough to put it in documentation and have it drive protocol decisions for other handlers. Ovithkes made a sound that Calvor had not heard from her before. It was not quite agreement and not quite discomfort, and it existed in the space between those two things. She turned back to the sensor logs. Then she said, very quietly, show me. The next session was not scheduled. Ovithkes requested it directly. The compound protocol required a minimum 4-hour preparation window before any approach to the Drath zone, and Ovithkes, who had spent 32 years enforcing compound protocols, waived it herself. They walked to the zone together, all 3 of them, and Dara carried a document folder, actual printed material on physical paper, because she had explained once to Calvor that screens required the same small attentional engagement as a held conversation, and physical paper allowed the eyes to settle in a way that screens didn't, and the settling of the eyes was part of what the Drath was reading. He had not questioned this. He had stopped questioning things around week 16. She sat at the boundary line. She opened the folder. She began reading. Ovithkes and Calvor stood at the observation panel 20 meters back. And for a long time nothing happened, and then the Drath moved. It came from the far wall. It was large in the way that Category 1 designations implied, but that a description could not prepare you for, and it moved with the quality of something that was not deciding to move but simply was movement, continuous and unconditional. It crossed the zone in the time it took Calvor to draw a breath, and it stopped 1 meter from the zone boundary, which was the closest it had been to any handler or observer in 4 years, and it stood there. Dar did not look up. The Drath did not move. For 40 seconds, a Category 1 behavioral hazard and a human woman from Earth occupied the same space 1 meter apart, and one of them was reading, and the other was trying to understand something it had no category for, and neither of them made a sound. Then the Drath did something that Calvor had no documentation for. It lowered its head. Not the aggressive forward drop of a predator preparing to charge. A different movement. Slower. Downward. The way an animal moves when it is offering its eye line to something instead of using it as an instrument of dominance. Ovithkes made the sound again. The one between agreement and discomfort. How? She said. Just the word. Not a full question. I don't know, Calvor said. And then, because it was true and because he had given up trying to protect his professional ego around week 18, I've been trying to understand it for 25 weeks and I don't know. She said it was lonely. Yes. And she's treating it like a communication problem. Yes. Ovithkes watched Dara turn a page. She watched the Drath hold its position. She watched the quiet, impossible, sustained fact of a human being reading in the presence of something that should have killed her, and she said, very quietly, what did she do before this? Wildlife rehabilitation, Calvor said. 8 years. On Earth. On Earth. Earth animals. Yes. Ovithkes was quiet for a moment. Then, do you know what I did before I evaluated facilities? No. 14 years in the field, she said. Active handling. Every Apex class on the Compact's registry. She paused. I have never, in 46 years of combined experience, seen a Category 1 hazard do what that animal just did. She turned to look at him. Has she explained it? In any way that makes sense to you? She's explained her method, he said. The cross-referencing. The framework. The parallel behavioral architecture between Earth species and Vethran species. She's explained every specific decision she made. He paused. I understand the explanations. I don't understand how she trusted them enough to act on them. That's what you don't understand? That's what I can't explain, he said. The logic is coherent once she walks you through it. But the logic required her to sit in the open zone with 2 cubs in her lap on day 11, with no backup, no certification, and no guarantee that the framework held. The logic required her to go to the draft zone 36 times in a row and sit there with a book. Every single time, the logic required her to trust a framework she had built herself, from first principles, in a species she had never encountered. He looked back at Dara through the observation panel. And she did it. Every time. Ovithkes turned back to the zone. Dara had looked up. She was not looking at the draft. She was looking at the wall to her left, resting her eyes, the way someone does when they've been reading for a while. The draft was still. Its head was still lowered. The air in the zone had the quality of something that had been working toward resolution for a long time and had not finished yet. She told me it would take 8 to 10 more sessions before the draft classifies her, Kaelvor said. She's planning to go back tomorrow. The day after the formal assessment, Ovithkes said, Yes. She doesn't know what I'm going to write in the report. No. It doesn't change her plan. It doesn't change anything about how she works, he said. She's been doing this since day 1. The reports, the access, the certification review, the level 4 violation, none of it changed anything. She came in every day and did the work. Ovithkes was quiet for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice had changed in a way that Kaelvor recognized because he had heard the same change in his own voice, in private, around week 14. It was the voice of a professional who has been doing something for a very long time and has just been shown something about it they had not previously seen. She'll get her certification, she said. Full authorization, full roster access, Category 1 clearance pending my documentation of today's session. She paused. I'm going to recommend the Compound's Behavioral Research Division review the cross-reference methodology. Not for her specifically. For the framework. Kaelvor nodded. It's going to unsettle people, Ovithkes said. The idea that Earth's predator ecology and veteran predator ecology share enough convergent architecture that a human rehabilitation specialist can transfer methodology directly. She paused again. It's going to unsettle people because of what it implies. What does it imply? Kaelvor said. She looked at him. She looked like a person choosing whether to say something she had already decided to say. That she hasn't been learning our system, she said. She's been applying hers. And ours responded. Inside the zone, the draft exhaled. It was a sound Kaelvor had heard from it only twice before in 4 years, both times after feeding. A low, settling exhalation. The sound of an animal that has been tense for a long time releasing something it didn't know it was holding. Dara turned another page. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The assessment report that Ovithkes filed ran to 63 pages. Kaelvor read it once, in full, the night it was transmitted. The technical portions were thorough and exact, documenting every species interaction, every behavioral data point, every protocol consideration with 32 years of precision. The final section, the evaluator's personal assessment, was 7 paragraphs long. He read those 7 paragraphs 4 times, because they did something unusual for a regulatory document. They tried, with the careful and imperfect language of a scientist who has seen something she doesn't have full words for, to explain what Dara Ose was. Ovithkes had written that in 46 years of combined experience she had observed many handlers who possessed technical skill, and many who possessed intuition, and occasionally handlers who possessed both. She had written that she had not previously encountered a handler who possessed what she described as structural empathy, the capacity to inhabit a foreign behavioral framework so completely that the framework began to respond as though the handler were native to it. She wrote that this quality was not teachable through any methodology she had encountered, and that she did not know whether it was specific to this individual or to the human species, and that this was a question the field needed to take seriously. She had written, in the final paragraph, that she had observed the draft zone session and that the behavior she had witnessed from a Category 1 behavioral hazard was not consistent with any documented response to any handler in the compound's history. She had written that the draft had not been conditioned. It had not been trained. It had not been managed. Something had happened in that zone that she could document factually and could not fully explain, and she was not, as a scientist, willing to paper over the gap between those two things with terminology she didn't mean. The final sentence of the report said, "I am recommending immediate full certification and categorical access authorization for Specialist Dara Osei, and I am filing this addendum to the formal record. I have spent 32 years believing that the relationship between handler and predator was a management relationship. I am no longer certain that was the right frame." Calvor set the report down. Through the window of his office, the compound was quiet. The predators were settled for the night. Somewhere in the facility, Dar was probably asleep, or possibly reading, preparing for tomorrow's session with the draft. Session 37. Working toward the moment when a Category 1 behavioral hazard finally found a category for her and decided what she was. He thought about what Ovithkes had written. About structural empathy. About a framework that had responded as though the handler were native to it. He thought about a human sitting in the dark, practicing the breathing pattern of a Galactic predator for 4 days before she trusted herself to go in. He thought about something Dar had said on the first day, sitting across from him in the intake office, the part of the conversation he had turned over most often in the weeks since. She had said the mother wasn't aggressive, she was anxious. Anxious animals and aggressive animals look similar from a distance, but they respond to completely different interventions. He had thought she was talking about the shadow cat. He was not, anymore, entirely sure she was only talking about the shadow cat. He turned off the light in his office and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the compound settle. The distant respiratory sound of the Grell pack, synchronized in sleep. The soft, padded weight of the shadow cat family shifting in their zone. The silence from the drafts sector, which was a different quality of silence than the absence of sound, the silence of a very large thing that was present and attentive and working on a problem in the dark. He thought that in the morning Dara would go in. He thought she would sit down and she would open her folder and she would read. And the draft would move closer. One more session of distance resolved. One more session of language learned. And somewhere in the compact's administrative systems, Ovithkes's 63-page report was traveling toward people who would read the technical sections carefully and would almost certainly miss what the final 7 paragraphs were actually saying. The way he had missed what Dara's reports were saying. The way the compound had missed what was happening on the floor for 11 weeks. The way everyone, every time, seemed to look at a human doing something patient and quiet and thorough and file it under no immediate significance. The compound systems registered the draft moving in its zone. One step toward the boundary. Settling again. Not charging. Not displaying. Just closer than it had been yesterday, doing the slow work of understanding something it had never expected to need to understand. Calvor thought that if the galaxy kept making the same mistake, one day it would not be a Category 1 behavioral hazard that was doing the learning. He thought that whoever was on the other side of that equation would need, very badly, to have read Ovithkes's final paragraph. He turned the light back on. He opened a new document.